Michael was well respected and trusted throughout the halls of the State House, even from the toughest of critics. He spent 15 years covering Governor Chris Christie and his team as both U.S. Attorney and Governor. As Christie describes it, he reported on his tenure without fear or favor, a scrupulously prepared journalist who was always on the hunt for the truth. Former Governor Chris Christie joined me to share his memories of what it was like being on the receiving end of those tough questions. Governor, when I think back to your tenure, you often called on Michael Aron first when you would hold those sort of epic press events in the outer office. Everyone was crammed in there. Was it out of respect for the elder statesman, or were you genuinely curious what was on Michael Aron's mind to ask you that day?
Both. First and foremost, it was out of respect for him. I had known him for a number of years already at that point. He had covered me through my 7 years as U.S. Attorney and in the '09 campaign for governor. And so I'd known Michael for a long time. But also, it was because he always seemed to get not to the obvious point, but to the subtext. And I enjoyed the banter back and forth, and we would have a lot of good banter back and forth. And then I hoped it would kind of set the tone for what the rest of the press conference would be like.
You did, and yet he always remained so serious, even when you had a few jokes to quip. He was unflappable in that way.
Absolutely. Look, he was a pro in every sense of that word. And when you were off the record, as you know, Brianna, had a great sense of humor and enjoyed a good laugh as much as anybody. But when it was game time, Michael brought his game, and you had to be ready as the person who was on the receiving end of those questions. That
makes me think of, and of course you weren't there, but one of the Correspondents Club's dinners, Michael dressed up as you. He sang "I Got You, Babe" song, acting as you. I think he also dressed up as your press secretary, Mike Druniak, once. I never got to ask you what you thought of that and his rendition of you singing the song was, and just taking on the role of Governor Christie.
Oh, I thought it was great, and it was a compliment. And like I said, I was referencing before, he had a great sense of humor. And so in those moments were the times when he got to display that sense of humor to a broader audience. But I loved it. I laughed, and we talked about it afterwards. And he wanted to make sure that I was okay with it, and I told him I was just fine.
Was there ever a particular story he did where it made you shift in your thinking, or even in how you approached a policy? Did he ever move the needle for you in that way when reporting on you?
You know, it was more the things that he would change in me would be the way I would think about a topic or approach it. Michael's questions were often very analytical. As I said, he would often go for what the subtext was, what he used to call the real story. And so he would get me to look at things a little bit differently often than I did before. And I would often take delight, because he was great at reading the tea leaves, that often take delight when I would get a chance to fool him. And one time I remember in particular was when I had to appoint the replacement for the late Senator Frank Lautenberg. Yeah. And Michael was speculating with a lot of different names, but he did not speculate about the one I ultimately picked, Attorney General Jeff Chiesa. And when the two of us walked out of my inner office to the outer office, Michael was sitting in his typical front row seat, and he looked at me and he winked and he said, "Hiding in plain sight."
What a typical Michael one-liner. Hey, how did he come to have that designated seat in your outer office?
It wasn't us. It was the respect that the rest of the members of the press corps had for him. I don't think any of them would dare take it. They knew that was where he should be. And while there were a lot of other senior people who covered me over time, there was no one like Michael, and everyone else knew it. And he stood up for the other members of the press corps too. There was a time when one reporter wrote a story that I thought was really unfair. And so I did what I would do from time to time with reporters that would do something like that. I called it putting them in the penalty box. And they would come to the next press conference and they'd be raising their hand, and I just wouldn't call on them. And this one particular time, after we were done with the press conference, my secretary came back in and said, Michael Aaron wants to see you alone for a moment off the record. I said, okay. And he came back in and he said, look, I know you put this particular reporter in the penalty box today, as you call it. And he said, Governor, I want to urge you, don't do that. He said, it affects his ability to do his job. And that's not right. And you know what? He was right. And those are the kind of ways that Michael had influence on me. And I think that story not only shows how honest he was willing to be with me privately, but also how he felt like every member of the State House press corps was someone that he wanted to make sure got treated fairly, and that if necessary, that he would protect himself.
Governor Christie, thanks for coming on to share some memories about our friend, our colleague, Michael Aaron. Thank you so much.
Brianna, thanks so much for having me, and my condolences to Michael's friends and family. He will be missed.